Hi everybody, it's Mena. Welcome back to my channel, or if this is the very first video that you're seeing of me, then welcome to my channel. Please be sure to hit the subscribe button down below if you haven't already. I post every day of the week. And today in this video I'm going to talk about my top 10 most helpful knitting tips. Now here are some tips that I personally think are great for knitting, and these are some tips that I thought of on my own pretty much, and then these are like also very important tips that a lot of knitters use as well and stuff. So I'm just putting it in my own words of how of these tips for knitting, and I know they're pretty common tips, so some of you guys, if you already knit, you probably know this, but if you're a beginner and you don't know these tips, I thought this would be helpful for you guys. So I'm going to get started. So number one on my list had to be choose a thick yarn and large needles. Now here's an example of large needles. These needles are size 13. You can't really see that, but sorry. These are size 13, and this is thick yarn. This is Line Brand Color Made Easy, for those who are wondering. So this yarn is a lot thicker than the original worsted weight yarn, and it's easy to see your stitches, and it's great to knit with. So just so you guys know, these are not the recommended needle size for this. This recommends a size 10, but I just have these as an example because I thought I'd just grab them for you guys to show you what big needles look like. So they say it's important to use large needles instead of small, even though when I first started knitting, I started with worsted weight yarn and kind of like smaller needles because like I got a kit and that's what they had in the kit. So yeah, so important thing is to use thick yarn and big needles, so then you can just see your stitches and it makes it easier to maneuver your stitches around. Number 2 on my list, have to make sure you know how many stitches to cast on. So when you're doing math and you're doing a certain stitch, you always have to do it in a certain multiple. Like for example, the raspberry stitch is multiples of 4 plus 2 knitted flat, but if it's in the round, it's knitted multiples of 4. So here's an example. So my example is my raspberry snood. I have a raspberry snood right here. This I wanted to be about 8 inches, 7.5 inches wide. This is what it looks like. It's 7.5 inches wide. Please ignore that. That's Daisy barking, and it's 25 inches long. So the way this works is like, because I wanted it wide enough to fit around the neck, so it can keep you warm and stuff like that. And it's really great because like sometimes if you have something thicker, it makes it warmer and stuff. So it kind of usually depends on what kind of thickness you want and stuff, or or how thin you want your project and stuff. If you're creating your own pattern, make sure you know how wide you want it and then how many stitches to cast on, and measure the inches wide. So it's kind of sort of like checking your gauge almost. Number 3 on my list would have to be pay attention to your pattern. Now this is one hard thing a lot of people I've noticed have, and I definitely do have a hard time with this too. So one thing I have is sometimes I get, when I'm doing my pattern, I sometimes get lost of which row I'm on, because if I have to repeat it, I have to like write down which row I'm repeating and how many times I'm repeating it, because or else I'm going to get lost and count again. And so this really helps me to like pay attention to which row I'm on if I write it down, and also to know what stitches go where and how many stitches to do this certain stitch in, and it really helps me to know where to put the stitches and everything. So that's an important thing to do, is always pay attention to your pattern and where it says to put your stitches. Number 4 on my list had to be, if you need a certain measurement, measure after every 9 or 10 inches. Now I think this is a good tip for me, because I definitely don't like measuring after every row, because I feel like that takes 10 times longer. For me, I feel it's easier to measure after every 10 rows, because then I can make sure I'm not making my project too wide and stuff, and it also gives me an estimate of how many more rows I need to knit to get to that certain inch. And so if you have a hard time with like measuring after every row, try measuring after every 10 inches, because it makes it easier so then it doesn't take as long if you're not a very patient person. Number 5 on my list should have to be, if you want to create your own pattern, check your yarn label for the recommended needle size. So right here I have the same yarn. And if you look right on the back right here, you can't really see that, so I don't know how to focus this. I apologize, I don't know how to focus this camera in the front very well. You have to do size 10 needles. You have to do size 10 knitting needles. It says usually on the label. label. Go by the US size, but if you're in England, just go by the millimeter size, because in England they use the metric system, but in the US we use regular sizes. I hope that makes sense. So if you want to know like what needle size, just always look at the yarn label to make sure you know what needle size to use for your yarn, because like sometimes it doesn't really matter if you go up or down slightly, but mainly it's always important to use the needle size that the label on the yarn calls for, so then it's not too tight or it's not too baggy or loose. Number 6 on my list has to be know the multiples of stitches you want to cast on. So this is a raspberry stitch or trinity stitch. It works in multiples of 4 plus 2 knitted flat, but if you're doing it in the round, you only knit multiples of 4. So you just subtract 2 when you're doing it in the round, because the multiples of stitches are important to the stitch you're doing, because then the stitch turns out right. So I hope that makes sense. So for example, if you're doing a rib stitch, you mainly always have to cast on an even number of stitches, so then your ribbing can end up exactly right. I've actually had moments where my ribbing had ended up in like threes and the twos, like 4s. When it was a 2x2 rib one time, I accidentally had another two knit stitches from at the end from when and then I had 2 knit stitches from when I first started, so my ribbing didn't turn out right, so I had to take it off and unravel it because I didn't pay attention to how many stitches I was doing and stuff, because sometimes I'll cast on so fast that I don't pay attention, that I forget to count my stitches. Number 7 on my list would have to be hold your yarn in a way that you're comfortable with. So a lot of you guys know how I hold my yarn. I know most people will wrap it behind their index finger, underneath their middle and index, and then behind their pinky. Some people just wrap it around their finger several times and stuff. Some people wrap it around their finger 2 or 3 times. It usually depends. Like some people just do it like this. Some people do it like this. Some people do it like this. It just mainly just depends on, nobody actually really does it like that, but I'm just showing an example. It just depends on how you're comfortable holding your yarn. I know a lot of people mainly like me hold it behind their index finger in front of their middle and second finger, and then behind the pinky. That's the way I find it more comfortable, because that's how I learned how to hold my yarn when I first crocheted. Number 8 on my list would have to be make sure you have enough yarn for your project. Now, I've had this problem happen to me several times before. Like, I bought like 2 skeins of yarn one time when I was knitting a couple things, and I accidentally didn't realize I wasn't going to have enough, because I thought I usually just buy 2 skeins just to be safe. But sometimes 2 skeins isn't always enough for your project. It usually depends on how much your pattern calls for. Or if you're just doing a project on your own pattern, just buy a couple extra skeins, because you don't know how many skeins it'll take to do your pattern. For this pattern, this takes me usually about 2.5 balls of Lion Brand Wool-Lace Thick and Quick, or sometimes it just takes me about 2 full balls of 2 balls. Okay, so sometimes this takes me about 1.5 balls of Lion Brand Wool-Lace Thick and Quick. Sometimes it takes me about 2 balls of Lion Brand Wool-Lace Thick and Quick. It usually depends on the meters, the yards of yarn. This yarn right here has about 400, if you can see that, 247 yards. And whoopsie, dropped my knitting needles. And I think the Thick and Quick has 100 and something yards, because this is so chunky. It's hard to kind of like wrap a lot of the yarn into a big enough ball, because sometimes chunky yarn doesn't always come in like a chunky yarn doesn't always come in like a big ball. Sometimes it doesn't have very much. I think Wool-Lace Thick and Quick has 100 and something yards, because it's super chunky. I'm not too sure. sure how many yards it comes in. If you guys know how many yards the small balls of Woolly's Thick and Quick come in, please let me know down in the comments below, because sometimes I usually don't have enough for my snoods, and I always buy 2 just to be safe, because mainly for me it takes 1 or 2 balls of yarn for me to make my raspberry snood. Number 9 on my list would have to be use a removable stitch marker. So here's what removable stitch markers look like. These are what they look like. These ones, if I can get them out. These ones have like a little hook on them, and then you can just slip it over a stitch and stuff. You can slip it onto a stitch. And then these are like little clips, so you can clip it onto your stitch. So it's good to use movable stitch markers for stitches that can't do a seam. Like for example, my Edelweiss beanie, that doesn't contain a seam and stuff, seam because it's a lot harder moving forward with that stitch. So the removable stitch markers, when I use them, it helps me keep track of my rounds and stuff, and how it just helps me keep track of my rounds in general for when I have to move the stitch marker, because sometimes I'll have to knit the first stitch with the last stitch together, and it's really helpful for me, because like what I do is I'll take the removable stitch marker, clip it onto my first stitch, and then I know where to stop my round and stuff. So because my Edelweiss beanie, it can't go in it can't have a seam because it's a lot harder moving forward. So removable stitch markers are great for projects that can't have seams, with stitches that can't have seams, because just the seams make it a lot harder moving forward. Number 10 on my list had to be, if you're using a tapestry needle, be sure to leave a long end for weaving. Now I see a lot of people do this in knitting, is when they're sometimes, like if they're knitting a scarf, or for some people also do this with crocheting, if they're knitting or crocheting a scarf, when they have tails, they don't leave a long enough tail to weave in. They'll probably leave it like this small or something, and that's not always enough to weave in the end. It makes it a lot harder, especially for me. I like, whenever I crochet, I usually just leave about like 8 inches of a tail and stuff, and that's easier for me to weave in that way if I leave a really long end. But if I'm knitting, I only leave about 4 inches, and I just weave it in with a crochet hook, and it makes it a lot easier for me, because that's how I learned how to weave in my ends. Okay, so those are my top 10 most helpful knitting tips. I hope you guys liked the video. Thank you so much for watching. Please be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already. I post every day of the week for a while, and I'll see you in another video soon. Bye! Sorry this video is so long.